You're watching Second Tier Sound. Let's take a deep dive into Raw by EastWest. You're going to learn what all the patches mean, what the instruments are called, where they come from, what they sound, and how to use them. Hi there, this is Sam with Second Tier Sound. Really nice to see you here. I create videos on how to orchestrate within a DAW, but also how to master your virtual instrument plugins. So if you want to support me so I can create more of these great videos, then perhaps consider become a patron or hit that PayPal link down below for a one-time payment. Anyway, what about the Raw library by EastWest? If you're anything like me, I felt this was a little bit of a challenge because I didn't understand what all the patches mean. I don't know what the instruments are, what they come from, and how to play them and in what context. So I made a deep dive into this library and created a video for you so you can understand all of that. Let's get going. So let's just quickly go over the interface because there are a few things I think you should be aware of that you might have missed. And in fact, EastWest might have missed a thing here too. So if you go into the browser, in the Opus browser, or perhaps Play, you see that you can select, for example, this one, and I will go Wind, and I'm going to pick this one. And what happens here is that you will see all the element patches. Element patches are basically just one articulation on each of these patches. But maybe you want the key switch patch. You can't see it. Where is it? But there are two solutions to this. You either go just below and click on the instrument, and then back again, and you will see now that it turns up here. You can choose it. If you click on elements, you will go back to the individual articulations. If you can't do this at all because there's only one instrument here, you can also find it by going to the database and then search for that instrument you want. All right, now let's go over to the Play interface. It's quite straightforward, nothing really difficult here. You can figure it out quite easily. But there are three things you really should check out. And the first one is the ADT. Basically, it sounds like there are more players, more of an ensemble feel. So really check that out. Then otherwise, you have a normal delay here, obviously. Then maybe you want to check out the stereo doubler a little bit. It's just very simple, but it does add a bigger space to the instrument, which can be very useful at times. But this one is the most fun one. And these are different micro tunings that I think all libraries can do in Opus, but this one is just easy to get to. And it's very effective with a lot of these libraries to get that sort of ethnical feel. So I really, really recommend to try them out. And it doesn't matter if it's the correct one. It can just create a fun sound. And then you can change the root key here as well. But otherwise, that's pretty much for the interface. Everything else is pretty straightforward. So let's go through all these instruments. And I just want to say first that I probably will butcher some of these names, but you will let me know. Okay, so let's go into Africa and bells. And as you can see, I've loaded them here already. And if it says Iwi in front of it, that is to the Iwi tribe in West Africa, in the Ghana area. So, and large bombshell, I didn't find too much information about it, but it's basically a metal bell, and they have a large one and a small one here, obviously, or medium rather. And then they have a gankokwe, large and small, that looks more like a traditional cowbell that you might have heard. Let's listen briefly to them. Bombshell. And the gankokwe. And if you put them all together, you might get something like this. So let's take a look at the drums. And as you can see, I've loaded them here. And we have the 3 feet from tom from, which is sort of big, large drum. They have two different sizes, the smaller one and the bigger one. And it's sort of a bass drum and a middle drum. So I put them together and it could sound like this. Now, the Atsi Mevo to me sounds very similar to the 3 feet from Tom Fron, and I wonder if it's the same drum or a version of it because it just sounds but the same. So I put the same pattern here, you can see. Maybe you can find out in your own research if there's any difference between these two. Then we have batas, which is sort of a drum that you put on your lap that has a drum on each side. You can see on the picture there. And then a berkete, which is sort of a bassier drum. So I put them together to get a really nice pattern. So you can see with the batas, you can get really nice polyrhythm there. And then we have the djembe ensemble, which is a very nice patch, actually. You have a lot of options, a lot of different drum sounds you can play with. It's actually one of my favorite patches there. I really think it works well. Then we have the iwi drum ensemble, which I assume is a collection of all these drums, basically, to have a more of an ensemble feel. Let's listen to it. And as you can hear, they're both drums and sticks and all kinds of stuff. So it's a really nice ensemble patch. Then kiri is another nice drum, and we have large udu, which to me is really sort of a vase, a big clay pot. But to me, it just sounds more of a bassy sound here. So I've used it as sort of a bass sound to accompany the kiri drum. Let's try that. See, a lot of these drums are basically different hollowed out wood, basically with some skin out of goat or a cow on top, and you use hands or sticks to get the different sounds. And then we have log drums as well, which is sort of a carved wood, basically, that is hollow as well, but doesn't have any skin on it, and then you hit it with a stick, and you get these different nice sounds. Okay, so let's take a look at the pitch percussion, which is basically percussion that has notes in it, so you can play melodies. And the first one, I think it's pronounced gil, is kind of a marimba, you know, so you can hit with sticks and get different notes. It has quite an interesting scale on it. Let's see what it sounds like. And then we have kalimbas, and there are all kinds of different kalimbas. So they have included the high one and a low one, basically a higher register and a lower register. A kalimba is, you might know, a little metal piano, you can almost say, that you play with your thumbs. And you can get quite a lot of interesting polyrhythms there. So when you try to program it yourself, I recommend you actually use two fingers and try to get some interesting rhythms. Let's listen to the high one first. And then the low one, which I think sounds a little bit more to the kalimba I'm used to. Now, all these examples are pretty short, but if you're a patron of mine, you will have access to all of them if you want to investigate them further. So let's take a look at one of my favorite instruments here in the plucked section. We start with the kora. It's a very, very beautiful sort of guitar harp instrument that you hold in front of you and you can play with all fingers. Let's see what it sounds like. And then we have the negoni, I think it's pronounced. It's sort of a very simple guitar-ish instrument with a few strings on it. You can create quite interesting rhythms with it. So let's take a look at the shakers. So the first one we have is African dual wooden, which I'm not really entirely sure what it is. But it sounds like an instrument that has two possibilities that you can hit and also shake. It has a nice wooden sound. So I created an interesting pattern with it. And as you can hear, a lot of these samples really have excellent sound quality. Just want to mention that. So African metal is just a bunch of metal sounds that you probably find in the smith or in the pile or in the junkyard. I don't know, but I created an interesting pattern with it. And then we have something called axatse, which is basically a big round gourd with beads on the outside. There are similar instruments like that in other cultures, but you can hear it sounds pretty much the same. And then at last we have the ekipiri, which is basically, you could say, a necklace with a bunch of different shells and stuff on it, different sometimes metal, that creates an interesting sound. So let's change the continent and let's go to Americas, both South and North America. And let's start with percussion. And the first one here is berimbau, which is heard a lot in capoeira culture. It's sort of a bow, you could say, almost, with a string on it. And it sounds like this. Yeah, it's quite a good sample, actually. Not very complicated, but I like it. And then we have Cuban percussion, and it's divided in 3 different instruments. And these are very good samples, but I'm a little surprised that they don't have more Cuban instruments. I mean, the cowbell and the clave is very, very important here. They do have bells in another section, but I don't understand why they don't put that in there. But anyway, let's listen to a pattern here. So let's continue with the plucked instruments. And I'm sure most of you know exactly what they look like and what they sound like here. So this is quite simple. I just wanted to say that the Washburn guitar, I feel this is not the greatest sound that this library has to offer. It's hard to get it to sound right, but maybe you can do it better than I do. Let's listen to it. And then after that, we have the jaw harp, which is not so difficult to get right, but it's a nice instrument to have. It really creates a very specific feeling. And then the banjo, and this is quite a simple sample, but it works really well. And if you know how to program it right, if you know how banjo is actually played, I think you can get really good results. And then we have the dobro, and I like these sounds very much because you get all those sound effects that you can make with the dobro that are hard to do with just a normal guitar library. I mean, a dobro guitar is not really the same thing, but you understand what I mean. But it's more difficult to play as a sort of guitar-ish sound. That is not so easy to do with this one. But the effects are really nice. And then we have the mandolin, of course. It has some nice sounds, but I do find this sound is also a little bit limited in actually getting a good mandolin sound, especially the more legato feel. I know there's no legato in mandolin really, but the notes don't feel so connected at times. And then we have the ukulele. And I think that works quite well. It's quite a limited library as well, but for what a ukulele can do, this works really nicely. So let's take a look at the wind in America. So what we have first is the didgeridoo, which I found interesting because I thought that was an Australian instrument, or the Aboriginals basically play that. I could be wrong. Maybe they play it in Americas too, but that's not what I learned. Anyway, it's nice to have. And I put two of them together here, one drone and one loop, so you can hear how they work together. You actually get a lot of different sounds there. Then we have the First Nation cedar, which is a Native American instrument. Very nice flute. Let's listen to that. And then the pan flute, which is more common, obviously, in the South Americas. Let's change continent and go to Europe instead. And let's look at the bowed instrument. And the first one we have here is galdulka. I think it's pronounced. The Bulgarian, very interesting instrument, quite simple. It's got that really interesting medieval sound. Let's listen to it. And then we have the hardanger, which is a Norwegian sort of folk violin. It is kind of a violin, but it just looks a little bit different. You can see on the picture there. There might be some other difference that I don't know of, how many strings and how the arc is and all that. But it sounds more or less like this. Right. And then we have the hurdy-gurdy. And I do not know the origins, if there was a first country, but I do know a lot of countries had this instrument, in the medieval times. It's sort of a violin that is run with a wheel that you stir like this, and then the wheel touches the strings, and then you press buttons to get different sounds. So it's quite easy to play in a way, at least to start with. I put on a drone and then a melody on top. The hurdy-gurdy drone, that is. Of all these instruments, I think the hurdy-gurdy is probably the best one. It has a lot of nice samples and you can get a good realistic sound out of it. But otherwise, the other bowed instruments here are difficult to work with because the legatos are not that great. And you really need that in order to get a bowed instrument to sound really well. Again, the samples are good and you can sort of tweak it out to get some nice, interesting sounds. But I wouldn't use it for like a big solo, really getting the real realistic sound out of them. Let's check out the European percussion. And they only have one drum, which I find is a little bit missing here. But I have to say, the frame drum here, I really like. They have a lot of velocity layers, or dynamic layers, I should say. And it sounds very, very good, like the real deal. So here it is. Let's check out the winds, and this is quite a fun one. So first one, we have the Alpenhorn. As you can see, it's from Switzerland, and it's basically an enormous wooden horn. And you can actually get quite a lot of notes out of it. You can only play one note on one instrument, but often they play them in ensembles. And it's a very, very beautiful sound. I think in real life, you don't get them as well tuned as you do in this sample library, but I still really like the effect. Let's listen to it. And then we have a traditional bagpipe ensemble. I don't know exactly what kind of bagpipe that is, but it's just a bunch of bagpipes together. And maybe it's not that difficult to sample this right, but I think this is actually truly excellent. It sounds very nice. And they have a nice live patch here, so if you hit the key a little harder, you get different articulations. Actually, a lot of patches are really like this. You have the elements, or you have the key switches, or you have the live patches where, depending on how you hit, you get different sounds. And then the bass recorder, which is an interesting addition. It's basically a recorder that is huge and has a very low sound. It's not that common actually in libraries, so it's a nice addition. So often used in more Baroque music. And for those who paid attention, you might recognize the sound from Mandalorian if you've seen that series. Anyway, then we have the Highland pipes, which is basically the Scottish bagpipe. If I'm saying this wrong, somebody's going to kill me. So I'm sorry, but I think it is. So let's listen to this. So to me, it sounds quite similar to other bagpipes, but I think that one specifically is from that area. And then we hear in the name, we have the Irish low whistle, which is a very nice flute. Quite simple looking, but they can create really beautiful sounds. Yeah. And then we have the launeras, which is a very interesting instrument or a flute that is from the Sardinian island, if I understand it correctly. And it's basically a bunch of small different flutes, kind of like a bagpipe in a way. You know, a bagpipe has several sounds at the same time, several horns, you could say, that sound at the same time. And this is actually the case with this flute too, even though it's quite tiny. I like that. It's quite an interesting medieval sound. And then we also have the Uilleann pipes, which is also a Irish bagpipe that is more melodic and not as, how should I say, dirty sounding like normal bagpipes. So let's go to another continent or the entire Far East, which is quite big, a lot of different countries there. But let's start with Bode, and there we have the erhu, which is sort of a Chinese fiddle or spike fiddle with two strings. Creates that very specific Chinese sound you might have heard. So let's take a look at the percussion instruments. And here we have quite a few. Now, I just want to say that the gamelan instruments, pretty much all of these, well, I don't really know about the names because I know them by different names than I've seen here. So it could be, I know there's Javanese and there's Balinese, different kind of names and ideas, and I'm not an expert. So I didn't really know what to do here because I actually don't know what instrument is which, but I will show you what it sounds like and show you some pictures of gamelan instruments. So we have the Bayonne group, which I think is a bunch of different instruments. Then the gamelan ensemble, which is also an ensemble patch with a bunch of different instruments. Then the gong and kajar, which are different gong sounds. And then katana group, it's also a group of instruments, and pamade. Now, again, I don't know exactly how they're pronounced. We can listen a little bit to the different ones. So we have the Bayonne here. Now, all these are different kind of metal instruments, sometimes wood, but mostly metal that you hit with hammers. And this sounds more like a round or gong sound. And then we have the gamelan ensemble. Bunch of different bells hit at the same time. Then the gong and kajar. So you have a gong down here and then some log kind of drums. And then the katana group, which to me just sounds like a specific instrument in the gamelan orchestra. And then pamade, which sounds very similar, but just a different register of those instruments. If you play them all together, then you get a pretty accurate gamelan orchestra sound. Right, and as you can hear, they don't normally use traditional scales. But then we have the kalung, which you might have wondered what that is. And that is sort of more of a marimba instrument that is made out of bamboo most of the time. You can either hang it like this, hold it like this and play, or you can lay down. And it sounds like this. And then further down, we have different kinds of gong. So we have a Chinese gong and a Thai gong. And it's basically a gong, obviously, but they are quite expressive. And some of them you can even tune to different notes. Let's listen to the Thai gong. So the Thai gong is quite an expressive instrument because it has a note in it, so you can really play with that. And then we have taiko drums. These are very accurate samples, but since it's very, popular to have these big drums and big orchestral music, it's hybrid kind of music, you might be a little bit sort of disappointed when you hear these because they're not that massive boom sound that you're sort of used to hear in other libraries. So you might have to put some effects in order to get that effect. So let's take a look at the plucked instrument of Far East. And first we have the koto, one of my favorite instruments. And it's sort of a harp guitar, you could say, that is laid out in front of you and you play it with your hands. A very beautiful Chinese traditional instrument that you often hear in their traditional movies. Let's listen to that. And then after that, we have the shamisen. I don't really know how it's pronounced, but it's a Japanese sort of guitar instrument. It has 3 strings and a very, very big, thick pick that really creates a very sharp attack each time you play with it. And even though it's a very traditional instrument, I've sometimes heard it with some rock metal bands. So, there are always new things to try. But this is what it sounds like normally. And then lastly, we have the Vietnamese jaw harp, which is pretty much similar to the other jaw harp. It just looks a little bit differently and has a little bit different sound. So let's check it out. So let's take a look at the Far East wind instruments. So we have the dizi, I think it's pronounced. It's a Chinese flute that you play on the side, like a flute, like a normal flute in an orchestra. And it sounds like this. I found that it has a very nice recordings, very nice samples, but it's difficult to do something with the legato sample on its own here on this particular instrument. Then we have the ragdung or ragdung. I don't know how it's pronounced. Ragdung, it's pretty funny, so hopefully it's not pronounced that way. But this is basically the Tibetan alpenhorn, you could say. It almost looks the same. Well, it doesn't really look the same at all, but it's a long tube, basically, that is ornamented. I think it's much more beautiful if you follow the Tibetan Buddhism, where it's used quite a lot in those spiritual traditions. So it has a more dirty sound to it. This is what it sounds like. And then lastly, we have the shakuhachi, which is a Japanese flute this time, which is also very expressive. So let's move not so far away from Far East. Let's move into India, a whole country this time. It's so big, so it's got a lot of instruments. And let's take a look at the bowed instruments here. And we have some interesting instruments. We have the baritone violin, which is kind of almost like a cello, but played like a violin. So it goes even lower than the normal viola. Very beautiful, expressive instrument. Again, the legatos in this sample library are not the best, but I really think you can get some good example if you tweak a little bit. All right, and then we have the esraj, which is kind of like a sitar with a bow, maybe. It's tuned similar to sitar. It looks almost like it, but you're using a small little bow instead. Let's try it. All these instruments sound pretty good, I think, and you can get a pretty good result. The only thing I miss a little bit is that you can't play very fast. It doesn't sound very good then. And even though in a lot of indie music, it's very common to play long and slow and meditative, there are also usually parts where it goes really quick. And it's hard to do that with these instruments. Anyway, the last one is sarangi, which is also a bowed instrument, but it doesn't look like a sitar at all. It looks like its own instrument. And, to the untrained ear, maybe you can't tell the difference between the sarangi and the esraj, really. But they are different instruments and they're played differently. So let's look at the Indian percussion, and they only have the tablas here. And I just wanted to quickly show that these are just different versions of the tabla. Here you have tabla and baya, and that's basically, you could say, the bass drum is the baya and the tabla is the higher drum. And you can have different kinds of tablas, different tunings there. And then you have tabla funky, which is just a sort of a little bit different sounds of the set. And then tabla only is only the high drums, and then tabla basic, which actually is the patch I recommend you to use most of the time, because these other patches, they have so many sounds, which is a good thing, but it can be a little bit overwhelming. If you don't know how to play the tabla, it's like, what key am I supposed to hit? And the good thing also with the tabla basic is that each key have more dynamic layers, so you can hit them differently and get more variation that way. All right, let's listen to the tabla here. It's a pretty good library, I have to say. You can get quite a good sound out of this. So this is one of my favorite patches. So let's take a look at the plucked instruments of India. And we have two instruments. We have sitar and tambura. And sitar is more of the melodic guitarish instrument. It's tuned in a very interesting way. It's quite difficult to master, but you can often see Indian players play really fast and very advanced melodies. And then tambura kind of looks like a similar instrument, but you notice it only has 3 strings and it is played more like a drone in one specific key. So it's more of a backdrop instrument, as you can hear now. Let's try this out. And the last section of India is wind, and they only have one instrument here, the bansuri, which is a flute that you play on the side, and it's normally made out of bamboo. Again, a very beautiful instrument, and I think it's well sampled. So really check that one out if you want to create some Indian vibes. Let's go to the last continent and let's work with Mid-East. So let's check out the bowed instrument, and we'll start with the Mid-East fiddle, which I actually don't really know what they refer to. I think it is what they call a spike fiddle, but I don't know the origin of the spike fiddle. Maybe somebody can help me out. But it sounds more or less like this. And it's quite a good idea to put one of the microtuners here to get that more authentic sound, rather than playing the normal Western scale. Then we have the Mid-East string section, which I really like, because maybe if you listen to some more Middle Eastern pop music, they often have strings in there, at least in a little bit older songs. And it's quite hard to do that sound with just your normal string section. So I really like this. You will see what I mean when you listen to it. Quite fun. And then we have the Yaili tambur, which I think is misspelt in the, they spell it with Y-A-L-L-I, and it's spelled Y-A-Y-L-I. Who cares, really? But you will find more about it if you spell it that way I've done here. It's a Turkish sort of bowed instrument. It kind of looks like a tambura from India, but with a bow and more strings, and you can play more interesting stuff with it. It sounds differently, obviously. Let's listen to it. So let's take a look at the percussion in Mid-East. And they only have one instrument here, the dumbek. And I'm a little bit, I don't know what's going on here, because Kandahar is a place in Afghanistan, which is not really Mid-East. I guess culturally, but not really. Also, a dumbek or darbuka, which are different instruments, but very, very, very similar, they're usually more high-pitched in their sound. And this is more of a bassy sound. So I don't know about this one, actually, where it comes from originally, if it's an Afghanistan instrument or something else. But I like the sound of it, and it does create a great Mid-Eastern sound. Let's listen to it here from the beginning. So let's take a look at the Mid-East plucked instrument. And again, these are some of my favorites. It seems like the plucked instruments is really what I like the most with this library. But anyway, we have the oud, which is sort of a guitar, you could say, from Mid-East. It's a very round, graceful instrument that can sound really beautiful, slowly, and very fast. Let's check it out. I recommend to really try out the microtuning or the different scales with these instruments, almost all of them. It just sounds more authentic. And then the santur, I think it's pronounced. I know that instrument actually exists in several countries, but it is basically a Persian dulcimer, you could say. Sounds pretty much the same as a dulcimer. Maybe it's made a little bit differently, I don't know. But this is what it sounds like. And the last section is the Mid-East wind. And here we have quite a few interesting instruments. We have the different kinds of duduks. We have the Armenian, Bulgarian, and Turkish. And they're very, very similar. The good thing is that you have a lot of variety, so you can try different things. Let's listen to all of them. All right, so I don't know if there's a huge difference between these instruments, but they look a little bit differently, and there's a lot of phrases here. So this is a really deep sample library. You can get a lot out of it, and it's very, very, very beautiful, very emotional. There we have the innate flute, which is a Middle Eastern flute, basically. And then lastly, we have the zurna, and I think that's Turkish, but maybe there are different zurnas in different regions. And it's a very nasal, kind of cool sound. It sounds like different kinds of horns that are used in all of Europe in the medieval times. So, what's the verdict on this library? What do I think about it? Well, it's been around for a while, and EastWest has created some new ethnical libraries that are a little bit better in some instances. But there are no ethnical libraries in the EastWest catalog that has this diverse variety of instruments. And the sound quality is actually really good. So, I do like it that way. But what I don't like so much about it is that I found it's a little bit inconsistent in how the samples or the patches are taken care of. For example, not all the patches have the same structure. It's a little bit hard to find how to use them, but particularly the more advanced bowed instruments, which are very, very difficult to get right. I wish there were more recorded samples that you can use, phrases, because otherwise it just sounds too synthesizer-y immediately. It's easier with the percussive instruments, but particularly the more advanced instruments, they are lacking a little bit, and some of them are not. For example, the duduk has a lot of interesting phrases and a lot of different articulations, while some other instruments have very few and you can't really do a lot with them. And some of them are actually real lacklusters. The guitar, I forgot the exact name, is just not very good at all if you compare it to the other samples. But overall, I really like it, and I do use it for when I need these different interesting sounds and also for sound design. So I want to give you one more tip before we finish this video for today, and that is to actually research these instruments. Go on YouTube, check it out how a musician plays it. Go on Wikipedia, find out more about it, its culture, its history, perhaps how it's played, what scale it's using. Just actually quite fun. It's almost like learning a new instrument in a way. Anyway, that's pretty much it for today. And I really sincerely wish that this video was useful for you, that you got more inspired to try these instruments out and perhaps create some more sound design or to use these instruments in your new ethical project. I don't know. So if you found it useful, then please let me know by hitting the like button, share this video, perhaps subscribe, or the Patreon thing as I told you before. So it was great fun creating this video. Until next time, hope you have a great day and make sure you compose a lot of music. Take care.